Cherryh is a really interesting figure for reasons that we'll talk about, and she's still alive, as is Wolf, and she lives now out in Washington. But I guess you could, in a way, you could say she's at least a titulary Midwesterner, since she was born in St. Louis. So let's talk about her biography, and then we'll do the world building. She does a lot of world building stuff, and then I have some philosophical themes picked out as usual. She is, in her 70s, born in 1942. Her last name originally is Cherryh, and she's going to change that in part because I guess she thought it was sounded a little bit too silly for a science fiction author to be taken seriously. That's the story told. And I don't have it in here, but she's born in St. Louis, but they end up in Oklahoma, and that's where she grows up. She has a younger brother who's considerably younger than her, who also was quite interested in science fiction and writing. And she was reading comic books, and then her father gives her a copy of Tarzan. So she's reading the sort of stuff that many of the other figures that we've talked about were into as well. And then something funny happens. Her family gets a television set. They start watching TV, and Flash Gordon, which she's really getting into, gets canceled. So she decides that she's going to start writing herself at 10 years old. And they asked her in one interview, how often did you write? She said, every day. And they were like, well, why were you doing this? Well, I thought that I would, since I couldn't get the stuff that I wanted, I would just create my own. That's kind of an interesting prospect. I think a lot of us would have, said, well, I don't know if I'm up to that, but apparently she thought that would be quite fun. And when she was 10, her mother heard her say that she wanted to become a writer and told her, you need to think about something that you can do so that you'll eat. So she started thinking already at that point, how do writers get paid? And she was researching it a little bit, finding out that many of them don't get paid quite well. And so she settled on a career which really worked out well in many respects. One way that you can live, you could say, the life of the mind, at least to some degree, and get paid to do something that's kind of like writing is teaching, right? So she decided, well, I'll become a teacher. And she goes to the University of Oklahoma, and she enrolls there, and she studies Latin. That's officially what she's going to get a degree in. But she also, dabbles, or more than dabbles, actually. She engages in some study of archaeology, of mythology, history of engineering, and she graduates from there, Phi Beta Kappa, and then gets this really prestigious fellowship to go to Johns Hopkins, and within a year she graduates with her master's in classics. And she begins teaching Latin and ancient history, and a few other subjects as well, for this school in Oklahoma City where her brother had gone to. And she does that for quite a long time. Now, while that's happening, she is writing manuscripts. And as opposed to a lot of the people that we've looked at, where they begin by first writing short stories, which then build into larger universes that they can, do. Remember the fix-ups where you take a couple short stories and you make a book out of it? Like A. Van Vogt was a master at doing that. She starts to writing whole novels, but she's been writing this entire time anyway. And she sends them out, place after place after place, and gets lots and lots of rejection slips. Doesn't do quite that well with it, but then eventually gets traction with this publishing house where a lot of her books would come out over the years, DAW. And it has to do with developing. Is that a DAW? Yeah, there you go. She develops a connection with one of the editors who returns her manuscript and says it's too long. We're looking for something different. So she said, fine, I'll write something that'll fit that bill, and she writes Gate of Ivral. And actually, I only put on the biographical timeline, I only put the things that fit into the Alliance Union universe. She's actually published over 60 novels, and that's not including collections of short stories, other collaborative projects that she joined in on. Other people would create a fictional world, and then they would say, hey, who wants to write some stories for this? She jumped in on a lot of those things. She also edited a number of works as well. So these are just the ones that fit in with the Alliance Union universe in some way or another. And she starts, publishing quite a few of these. She also wins a number of awards. I just have a few of them in there, some of the early ones. She gets a Best New Writer award, and at that point she says, okay, I probably can stop teaching. And she's making enough money doing that, and then wins a Hugo Award for Best Short Story. She becomes an artist in residence for a while at another Oklahoma university, and then a little bit later she receives the Hugo for this one. Big, thick, tome, very dense, and this is probably this is a great entry point, I'd say, into the whole Alliance Union universe ones, and it's one of the older ones. So that's why I picked Downbelow Station. That wasn't actually the first one that I read by her. I read things out of order, the way I think a lot of us often do. I read Heavy Time before I read the other ones. But it turns out that Heavy Time actually in the universe takes place before Downbelow Station, so that works out okay. And then she actually she's writing and writing and writing, and some of her works start getting adapted. She meets the woman who much later on, once it's legal, becomes her wife, Jane Suzanne Fancher, and their connection originally happens because Fancher is not actually a writer. She is working in graphics, and her Cherryh's books are being adapted, some of them, for graphic novels. Back then, would they have called it? Yeah, I guess 85 they would have called it a graphic novel by then. And they start working together collaboratively, and eventually, after a few years, Cherryh starts saying, you should start doing some writing of your own, and gives her some advice about it. And it's kind of funny because the story goes that at first Jane asks her, well, how do you write? How do you get the creative juices flowing and get things going? And so Cherryh gives her some advice, and then she finds she can't turn it off. And she says, how do you stop writing? How do you turn off all this creative stuff? And she keeps on developing further aspects of this Alliance Union universe. She wins another Hugo Award for another novel. You think this one is thick? Cytine is about twice the length of this one. It's actually a bunch of different things wrapped up in one thing. And a couple other things that are kind of cool about her story. She has an asteroid named after her. And it's particularly fitting because, she, probably more than any other author that I've encountered, really gives you a sense through her novels of what it would be like to be out there mining asteroids. Just the way she describes everything. And so this is a good entry to talking a little bit about her approach and her world building. She develops, let's put it through this way, she develops worlds in the sense of a narrative universe that are incredibly dense and very researched, but also very imaginative. I think if I had read her stuff when I was much younger, I probably would not have been able to appreciate it. I probably would have given up about 50 pages in, because there's so much descriptive detail about just, what docking a spaceship into a space station might entail, or about these what it's like to run a particular bureaucratic operation. There's all of this stuff that really tells us a lot about the world. She's put immense effort and thought into making this stuff real. But it is kind of like there's a description of one sci-fi game that a lot of people would start playing and then quit playing, and the joke was it was spreadsheets in space. That wasn't the name of the game. It was Masters of Orion. But the idea was there's just too much like having to keep track of details and things like that. Sort of like, when we talk about George R. Martin and who the hell are all these characters and what are they doing here? She's doing that, but she's doing it in a technological age where mankind has made it out into the stars, and there's very few margins of error for most people. So in the introduction to Gate of Ivral, or the foreword to it rather, somebody else who we've read, Andre Norton, talks about Cherryh as being similar to Tolkien, in that Tolkien created entire languages and then populated this world and has this long backstory. One of the handouts that I gave you is actually sort of a timeline of all the things that are going on in this universe. And this is a very truncated timeline, just drawn from the first few books. And Cherryh was doing something similar. Not so much for these books, which are primarily concerned with the human race, but the ones where she has alien species playing a major role. They play a small role in this, but the ones where they're playing a major role, she comes up with the entire social organization and back history, and sometimes actually languages and cultures for these different. And she thinks about how would they live. Some of them are methane breathers. How does their respiration work? So she puts a ton of work into that, and even for the ones that are primarily just about human beings, there's an awful lot of this as well. And that was actually one of the themes that I'd like to explore in a bit. But so let's talk about what that world, or that universe rather, is like. So it happens in our galaxy, and it actually happens fairly close. Much of it happens within the ambit of the Earth and Sol, our solar system, and then these stars that are a little bit further out. Because in the beginning of the storyline, there's nothing like faster than light drive. So how do we get out to the stars? And you notice with this timeline, now we're a little bit behind schedule in the way that she's got things arranged, right? She's writing this starting in the 70s and 80s, so not as much has happened. But the very first interstellar probe is being launched in 2005. Interstellar meaning going way out there, not just the planet, the interplanetary probes that we have, something that would go to a different system. We haven't done that quite yet. And between 2015 and 2125, she is predicting the first manned interstellar mission. Not just a interplanetary mission, not just, say, going to Mars, or going to, and where else could we get to? The asteroids. Can't really go to Jupiter because we'd be crushed, and the storms there are crazy. But they send out this ship to Barnard Star to build a station. And much of the existence of humanity out there in the cosmos is not like going, the way in the old space things, right? You have a ship, looks like a rocket, you land on the planet, shoot up the aliens. or maybe get along with them or something, and everything goes great. No, it's much more like it is for us. I mean, we landed on the moon, but we didn't stay. Maybe we'll land on Mars in our lifetime. We'll see. It depends on what the priorities of our political systems are. But we do have space stations, and they last for a while, and then they start to break down. You guys remember when that one came down? Was that in the 1970s or was that early 80s? And everyone was worried it might crash on them. This is before your time.
I remember it very clearly.
You do? Yeah. Was it Skylab, I think it was called?
Skylab, yeah, I think you're right.
Yeah. Was it the 80s?
It's the 80s,
yeah.
Was it basically like the ISS prototype?
Essentially, yeah. And these things have to go through iterations, too. And so when they become routine, that's when human beings can really spread out. It's not the very first thing that we do that's so cool that we have all the fanfare for that matters. It's really when it can become a job that people just do because it's better than mopping floors or something like that. That we'll know that we've really made it. And so they do this with creating these space stations out there in different places. And meanwhile, they're also sort of learning how to mine asteroids and terraform Mars and do all those sorts of things within the solar system. But they start sending out these ships, and if we're going to go to another another system rather than within our system, it's going to take a long time. And so they have essentially these colony ships where they're going to have kids, and those kids are going to have to be raised on those ships, and then they'll go to where they're going, build something, and then shoot it back this way. Big risk. I mean, what if something goes wrong? You'll never hear from them again, right? But once they actually have a foothold, then they can expand that a bit more. And something very interesting happens along this way. They start discovering extraterrestrial life, but the human beings that are going along on these voyages, they find out that they really have much more in common with each other than they do with their home planet, Earth. It's very difficult to relate to it because think about it, you would be gone imagine if you were gone for 70 years from this culture that we live in, and how much has changed just in 70 years in our time. Could we adapt? This is actually one of the problems that some of the guys that I knew when I was teaching in the prison faced, where they had been behind the walls, and there weren't any like furloughs or weekend passes. This is a maximum security prison. They'd be in there for 25 years, and cell phones did get into the prison through trafficking, but they had very little idea about what to do with them. They could see things on TV, but TV's not the reality that we live in. And then they would get out after 25 years, and it would be a massive culture shock. Even though they had people coming to visit them, right, and talking about what they were doing, they lacked some things to relate to it. So imagine being off on a voyage, totally cut off from Earth, except for these transmissions that would come in from time to time, and you can't make any sense of them. You become, in essence, a new culture. And that's what starts happening. And they start building more and more stations way further out. And some of them are actually by planets that can be used. So you notice they talk about Pell and Downbelow Station. Down below is Pell. This is here. You can see the station there. Kind of not a great drawing there, but typical sci-fi stuff, right? And it's this massive station where tens of thousands of people live. It can dock all these different ships, and down below there is a planet that has a race of humanoids already living there who turn out, fortunately, to be very nice and gentle, and they don't want to mess with people. They give them gifts and all that, because otherwise things would have gone pretty bad. And that planet allows them to farm, to develop foodstuffs and things like that. Cytine is another major world where that happens as well. So during all this time, Earth starts to go through a couple major changes. One of which is the discovery of extraterrestrial life throws a lot of people for a loop. And you can imagine, like, what would happen to our culture today if that were to happen? I think there's probably a lot of people who would have difficulties finding a way to fit it into their religious points of view, right? So I think we'd have some major religious crises. There probably would be some new religions developing. I think some people would be like, how can I make a buck off of these aliens as quick as possible? Others would be like, well, we should wipe them out, And so it would lead to a crisis, and that's what happens on Earth. Meanwhile, in the economic realm, there's a thing, the Earth Company starts to control a lot of the things that are going on within the solar system and outside of Earth. And so the governmental processes, there's things like the United Nations and all that, but the Earth Company comes to dominate, you could say, right? And now think about some of the problems with not just logistics, but decision making. So imagine like you're, 20 light years away, and you are as well, and you're that far away from her, and I'm back on Earth giving you guys orders about what you ought to do. And you guys are supposed to report to me every so often, right? And then we'll make him like the enforcer. He's got a spaceship, and if you guys don't do what I tell you to do, he'll fly out there. Of course, it's going to take him 20 years to get there. So by that time, he might have died, or you might have died, or the situation.
Have a lot of consequence, in other words.
Well,
the kids will take care of it.
Yeah, and the orders. So by the time that I actually get information from you about what conditions you're in, and I send you the orders don't make any sense at all. So what would you do in a case like that? Would you like try to implement the orders?
Only to the point of them making sense for the situation. If
Yeah.
the situation has evolved, then you can only take it to the point where it's relevant. If it's not, the orders are if it is in a situation that isn't going to be applicable to your current,
Yeah.
thing, then what's the point?
Well, that depends, because there are some people who orders are orders.
That's right. There are some people who are what we call, they think that they're following rules.
They're rule followers.
Yeah.
And
Well, they're all bears.
if they receive orders,
They'll make it work somehow, right?
They implement orders.
Yeah.
And they're not likely to question, does this make sense in the current situation?
Yeah.
And you've got other people who would look at it and go, this doesn't make sense anymore.
Yeah.
And would go with the spirit of the orders instead of the actual letter.
And some might be like, these people don't know what the hell they're talking about. Screw them. We're doing our own thing, right? And so you have that sort of conflict brewing on these space stations and on the few planets that are inhabited, way apart from Earth, and the company doesn't know what to do about this. And then two important things happen. One is they discover faster than light travel. And it gets discovered not on Earth, but out in the colonies. And they start to use it. So now, all of the think about it as sort of like a map, right? Although it would have to be like a three-dimensional map in space, and the coordinates would kind of move around here and there. But you could talk about a star map, and everything that, originally you had to go to this place to get to this place to get to this place. Now you can bypass all that. So it's sort of like, what we've experienced here in the United States, where, originally the quickest mode of travel around here, canoes, this whole area is littered with waterways that the explorers used. Chicago itself is they found this out through not just sort of doing anthropological studies and archaeological things, but you can actually look at imaging of it. It was a massive nexus of trade paths coming in from all over the place that the Potawatomi had kind of a little stranglehold over. And, what happens when something else comes in, like railroads? All those old modes of transport and all the ways of life oriented around them, they're at risk of going away. And then, at one time here in America, we had a great rail network. I was talking with a German guy today who was like, your rail network sucks. And there's a reason for that. Our road system and the American turn to the automobile, it's part of why we don't have great train transport like they do in Europe. Now we're facing driverless cars and driverless semi and freight and stuff like that within our lifetime again. A little bit of a hiatus because of that one driverless car that ran over somebody. That Uber, was getting into it, and then now it's sort of on hold, but it's not going to stay on hold for long. And all of these transformations change, booming areas into backwaters, and they also step up the issue of, well, should we take orders from these Earth people who don't know what the hell they're doing and they just want to make a buck off of us, or should we go off on our own? And some of the space stations, in effect, rebel. They say, Earth, you're not in charge anymore. And they become what's called the Union. And at first, the Earth response, and I know we're going over a lot of back history here before we get into actually talking about what happens, but so the Earth response is to say, okay, well, you're not going to obey. Well, we're going to fix you. And as soon as Earth gets faster than light drives, they start building this gigantic fleet, which has got 50 carriers in it, and they place it under this captain, Mazian, who's like a tactical genius and all that, and they send him out to enforce order on these colonies that have revolted and formed a union. Unknown to them at the time, that union solved a lot of their own problems. One of the problems is manpower. Earth is a long-standing planet, so there's tons and tons of people. You actually have too many people, just like we do today on Earth. So a lot of labor force that you can use. And out in the colonies, they don't really have that. So they start cloning people. They start labs in which you can make as many people as you want to. It still takes a while to grow them, right? But you can make them however you want, and you can teach them using what she calls tape, which we could probably think of today as sort of like some sort of induction method, where you would hear things and they'd be structured in a certain way, so you learn very quickly, and you can manufacture people. That's what the union starts doing. At all different levels, you need some really smart ones. Those are the ones that are called alphas, predictably enough, right? They go all the way down to these lower classes named after Greek letters, like row classes, basically just good for sweeping floors or carrying things around. And none of those clones actually have legal rights. They're bred for certain purposes, but they allow the population to vastly increase. And what ends up happening, this fleet goes out there, and things do not turn out the way they expected. They start getting their proverbial butts handed to them. Even though they're being run by brilliant officers and they have good discipline, they're not easily beating the Union. As a matter of fact, the Union starts to beat them, and eventually the fleet winds up turning to piracy and things like that because Earth is not supplying them with the resources that they need. And so now you've got a couple different things going on. At the time that Downbelow Station begins, Downbelow Station, Pell Station, is one of the bigger stations, and they are trying to remain neutral in what's going on between Earth and Earth's fleet, which now, by that time, only has a handful of their ships left, these carriers, and the Union, who seems to be advancing. There's a lot of chaos. Refugees start streaming in, brought from other stations and dumped on Pell. And Pell already has kind of a delicate balance going on between the different people there. And so they're caught in between. Long story short, what ends up happening is there's some fleet battles there between the Earth fleet and the Union fleet. And the merchants, the people who, so far I haven't talked about at all, the people who make all the economic stuff happen, trading things back, from one world to the other, carrying cargo, they don't want to be ruled by Earth, and they don't want to be ruled by Union. They don't want to be ruled by the fleet, because the fleet is always doing what military rulers tend to do to civilians, which is screw them around and impress them, meaning make them part of their process and treat them badly. So they actually end up forming their own new system called the Alliance, and that's why it's the Alliance Union universe. The fleet rebels, and except for one fleet captain, Mallory, heads back to Earth to attack Earth and try to take over Earth. And Mallory stays behind. She defects from the fleet with her carrier, and that becomes the backbone of the new alliance based in Pell and encompassing all these other stations and all these merchant vessels. And the merchant vessels, the last thing that I'll say about all this development stuff. So, again, imagine that you are living a very different life than the life we have here as terrestrial people, right? Imagine that you are going to be on a ship that jumps through space and time, and each one of those jumps requires that you be drugged up because it's so jarring to the body and to the mind. And imagine that you are traveling either from planet to planet or from way station to planet to new way station over and over and over again. And you may hang out on those places. You might go to drink and gamble and sleep and eat some real food or something like that, because you can't grow food on your ship. But your life is really those people on the ship. Sort of like being in the military or being in a company or something like that. But you never get to go home. You're living on that ship. Now imagine that you're related to everybody on that ship. They're all your family. And it could be 10 people, or it could be, like in the case of Merchanter's Luck and Dublin again, it could be 1,000 people, 1,000 cousins of yours, right? I don't know if any of you come from really big clannish families. Like mine is about 200 people, and we don't all get along and like each other. But can you imagine being cooped up with them for years on end? But they become very close, and they become, each of them, sort of like their own little world. You become very oriented towards your family. They do, the women involved in those do go off and sleep with people that they're not related to, so that the gene pool doesn't get screwed up from inbreeding. But they don't form any permanent attachments to those guys. The children stay with them. And so that's what the merchanters, that's what the traders are doing. So you've got, by the time that these books are going, you've really got a couple different major, you could call them factions or ways of living. You have the people within the Union, some of whom are bred to be a certain way, to exist in just a certain range of thoughts and desires and skills and stuff like that. You've got Earth, which is just a messed up place. Nobody knows what's going on there. But Earth is still, churning away. You've got the fleet, the Maziani, the people who follow Mazian, and they're still out there engaging in piracy and doing their thing. You've got the Alliance, which is based in Pell, that includes all these merchants. And then you've got all sorts of other free agents doing their own thing. And that's the universe in which these stories take place, at least the ones that don't involve aliens. And I haven't even talked about aliens. And I'm not going to say much about the aliens, because already it's too much, isn't it? It's almost well, how do we describe this? This is a massive.
Expansive.
Yeah, exactly. And one of the things that she said that I jotted down a few things from interviews, and one of the things she said about the Union Alliance universe was that she said, I decided to set up a situation in which there were no evil superpowers, just doing what superpowers do for their own survival, and to write stories from the viewpoint of people on both sides. And that's what she, I think, really does succeed in doing, is creating a universe in which the way that she tells the story, each of the characters, she gives you enough information about them. She tells you about some of the thoughts going on in their head. She develops them, and some of them are pretty bad people, but none of them are totally bad. There's nobody who's like a psychopath in there who just wants to destroy everything. And there's a lot of people who are pretty good, but none of them are like the good guy, the savior, the one person who's going to fix everything. And she looks at how their different decisions or negotiations interface with each other, and I think that's very interesting. I can imagine as a writer it must be very difficult to pull off, because I think it's a lot easier just to write the traditional space western, the guys who have the black hats and the guys who have the white hats and have them shoot each other with blasters, or the good guys are because they've got they don't have the red lightsabers, they've got the green and the blue ones, or things like that. I think that's a lot easier to write than this sort of thing. So I've talked at you a lot. This would be a good place to take a break, and any comments or questions before I talk about some philosophical themes, or you guys want to bring up some philosophical themes in the works.
This I've only gone through like 80 pages of Downbelow Station, and it reminds me, especially with like the timeline leading up to like the book that's going on, it reminds me a lot of a show that I watched before called Legends of the Galactic Heroes. Okay. Where it's basically like the present time for where the show takes place is, I don't know where, but it's basically like evil space Prussia Empire versus space, I don't know, basically like non-empire place, and then there's like space Venice. But like everything leading up to that was like very similar, almost exactly like it was going up with this. So like Earth sent out colonies, the colonies rebelled, Earth sends out enforcers, the enforcers actually managed to basically beat everybody up. Okay. But eventually the person that was in charge of that fleet becomes the king of the universe, basically. Yeah. And then turns on Earth in the process, and then basically takes over everything. I mean, that is one of the big problems with having enforcers. So here's another thing, too, that's quite interesting. So Cherryh, she draws a lot on ancient history. And one of the things you see happening over and over and over again in Roman history is some emperor shoring up his regime by bringing in a general or bringing in troops from outside, and they're going to fix everything. And he always forgets that, well, once they realize how weak you are, they can turn on you and take over. And a lot of the Roman emperors, there was actually a year of 4 emperors where, like in rapid succession, they did that. And the other thing is, too, it destroys legitimacy. Once you start monkeying around with that, people don't take you seriously anymore. Well, people take your force seriously, and they don't see you as having, any moral legitimacy that would make them willing to be loyal to you or fight for you. They're like, well, you got the best guns right now, so I guess I better, pay you my taxes, but they're not going to stick with you, right? And so you see these same, so this is really interesting, you see the same human problems playing themselves out because you can't get away from the human condition. Just by going to space.
You see the same thing in the Foundation books?
Oh yeah, you're right.
And in the Dune books, where the planets the civilization is spread out over different planets, and the cultures and the tensions between the planets, between the families.
Yeah, and you still have the same kind of games playing that people do. I mean, in Dune, that's particularly there with like the Harkonnens. They will always screw with everybody, right? You can't imagine them like taking it easy and not going after the other people.
We have people who like the Harkonnens whose focus is power.
Yeah.
And the different human characteristics we see.
Yeah.
In everything.
Yeah. One of the things I do like about her series too. So, like at the start, the Alliance or the Union people are portrayed as being kind of scary. They're doing all this cloning stuff. We don't know what's happening way out there in these far stations. We just know that they're like beating the fleet, and the fleet they've turned into bad guys. But these Union people, they might be sort of like in Star Trek, like the Borg. They're going to assimilate you, and you're not going to have any choices. It's a very sort of regimented way of life. And so the Pell people are like, well, we don't want that, But when she starts writing about the Union, it turns out that things are just as screwed up there as they are anywhere else. There's just as many feuds and power struggles, and they have their own government, which is like split between a couple different factions, some of which really want to push this, like they're the expansionists, they're called. And then some want to, they're called isolationists, and they want to like just withdraw from Earth altogether and build their own new sort of civilization. And then there's the moderates in the middle. And you wouldn't guess that like from the outside. If you were in the one territory, you wouldn't look inside and see that. It's sort of like here today, we often think of foreign countries that we see as rivals as kind of like monolithic, right? The Chinese, are great rivals. But if you get closer in, you see, wow, China is just this massive panorama of all these different people competing, cooperating, misunderstanding each other as well. Or we could think of other places too. Even North Korea, there's got to be somebody who thinks differently than the state, right?
I mean, all of these writers, it seems like, even when they take this way out into the future, they never account for any evolution in the human condition.
Oh.
It's always the same problems. It's always the same circumstances. Nobody's gotten ever beyond all of that. Like you're just
the political stuff, yeah.
And it
The
seems
human
like
nature stuff.
the human nature. I mean, it gets never transcended to grow into a higher level. It's always the same old thing. Whether you want to talk thousands of years, the writers never seem to grasp that maybe
Clark
there could
did.
be change.
Clark did, but then that makes it less of a narrative in some respects.
But that makes it less, I want to say less real, but less...
It's going to be less interesting to read.
Relatable.
Yeah.
It makes it less relatable.
Well, there is something to that, though. I mean, with Cherryh, there are some attempts to do something that would like transform the situation that way, and you can see that what the Union people are doing as representing a new way forward for humanity, but then it winds up usually not working that way, right? So they're gonna like deal with the problem of natality by just have clones, and then you got to figure out, well, what are we going to do with all these clones, right? And then people start getting unscrupulous in how they're handling them, and or they come up with like the tape thing. Okay, now imagine, wouldn't you like if we could actually just like take a certain drug and then listen to a tape or whatever, some MP3, and we'd have all this knowledge? Wouldn't that be cool? But then, who creates the tapes, and can you put subliminal messages in them? And that's the sort of question that she does have characters who are like, or not just characters, but like movements or people who are putting something new forward, but there's always some fly in the ointment, you know. You can never totally transform human nature towards some sort of good in that way. I mean, think about the technology of like the jump drive, which allows you to move from star system to star system. Seems like a neutral sort of thing, but it could be used to send an attack fleet to just, do a raid. It could be used to engage in trade. It could be used to do a diplomatic mission. It really depends on how your culture is developed, doesn't it? And I think we could say the same about most other technologies in this.
Well, I guess, there's just a lot of imagination effort put into all of the technology and all of the other things. But the imagination isn't put into transcending the human condition or human nature is what I'm trying to get at.
Yeah.
That, yes, it would not be as relatable as now, but it would be, again, it's putting something that doesn't exist presently, as all of this does, into what could be.
Yeah, and in the case of a lot of her characters,
I'm just saying that across the board with a lot of science fiction writers, they seem to go, but they never actually evolve the person. It's always the tech or the worlds or something else, but the person never changes.
What was that?
The individual person, or you mean like people?
Yeah, I'm talking about
human nature.
Human nature.
What was that one movie, Beyond the Black Rainbow? It was the one where they dip the baby in the black goop and the guy goes into...
Oh, I haven't seen that.
Guys, you see a lot. You have a lot of things I've never even heard of. You must have some kind of resources.
Well, what did
it's probably true vice versa, too.
So what happened with the...
So, I think, okay, Beyond the Black Rainbow, I think is the one I'm thinking about, with the bald, crazy guy at the end.
Okay.
But basically, it changes, it's either he changes human nature, and that's how it would relate to you, and basically what he saw when he got dipped into the black changed him so much to the point where he wasn't even human, or it was something about he saw things that he shouldn't have, and his nature didn't really change.
Yeah. Well, I think there's two things to say about Cherryh. Go ahead.
So you see attempts to change human nature. When we read the Rama books. The Rama
with Clark,
series, with Clark.
Yeah.
The Ramans tried to set up a utopia.
Yeah.
With the humans and with the other species. And human nature exerted itself.
Well, yeah.
And you see it in the dystopian fiction like Divergent, where somebody's trying to create a different kind of society.
Yeah.
They're trying to put something together that goes against the human nature we've seen all along, and
to transform it into something better.
Transform it in some way.
Yeah.
And then it never works.
Yeah, I mean, with the, you could say maybe there's something fundamentally wrong with human beings then, and we did look at one author who had the aliens bring that up as an issue. With the genetic modification and saying that the human beings had a sort of an interesting paradox to them. On the one hand, they were very intelligent. On the other hand, they were hierarchical. And you put those two things together.
Who was that?
I'm blanking on her name right now. Octavia Butler. Yeah, so, with that one, there's aliens that are, and the aliens don't have it all figured out either, but they're further advanced than human beings are. And they're like, we're going to try to, we're going to give you the opportunity to, work this crap out of your system.
But then the theme of the books, though, becomes, when you make that change,
are we still human?
Are we still human?
Yeah.
When you make that kind of a change, then do we stop being human, or are we something else?
Yeah. So
and you see that in Rama.
Yeah. And Childhood's End.
And Childhood's End.
Yeah, we can't relate to those children who become part of the overmind, and it's very sad.
Well, when we first started out way back when.
Yeah.
We certainly are different now. And we're still human.
Yeah.
And we're not nearly as primitive, as violent, and as everything else. So why is it in the future we cannot evolve into something a little bit better than, because we have been getting better.
Yeah.
But what I'm saying is normally,
Oh, we
I'm
get-
probably beating this dead horse, it probably doesn't even
No,
matter.
it's
I just think
this is a very important philosophical question.
that science fiction writers generally do not take, as they take everything else into the future, they don't take humans, because we are evolving, we're not the people we were, 20, 30, 50, 600,000 years ago,
Except as we evolve, we see backlash.
Well,
We're seeing violence today that
Well,
we
not
haven't
like
seen
we
in
were.
a long time.
Yeah, but not, I mean, we have come a long way from that.
We came a long way, but now we're seeing some
Yeah.
backlash
Yeah,
in our
but
society.
not nearly, not like.
I think for human nature, it's like a 2 steps forward, 1 step back process.
But that's the thing, then there is still one step
There's
forward,
still one step
right?
forward, yeah.
And so there's a cumulative process, and I think that's right. Actually, Cherryh had something interesting to say about that. She said, having made a thorough study of the past, I'm certain that I do not wish to live in it, nor do I wish to see 3/4 of the planet weltering in conditions that should have been left in the past with the same hunger and disease our ancestors knew. The reach for space and its resources is the make or break point for our species, and the appropriate use of technology and the adjustment of human viewpoint to a universe not limited to a blue sky overhead and the curvature of the horizon are critical to our survival. Therefore, I write fiction about space and human adjustment to the unfamiliar.
Okay, I like that, human adjustment,
Yeah.
here we are. Yeah, okay, she recognizes it.
I think, though, so to go to a lot of the characters are, you might say, stuck in situations where they would like to do something different. They would like to be better people. They would like to be more charitable or just or something like that. But because of the way, like the economic situation that they're stuck in, they're like, well, I can't do that because I'll be screwed. I won't be able to make my profit margin, or these people will take advantage of me. And it's sort of like there's always so much of the past, of the ways that we've done things before, that gets kind of brought along like detritus with us.
You're still restricted by the conditions.
Yeah. So and so the alternative to that is like, let's wipe it all clean. And sometimes you can do that, but it's pretty rare that you get an opportunity to do that. Most of us are stuck dealing with the stupid cobbled together stuff. And if we can be good people, it's like in this little way, not in some sweeping across the board way. So, I mean, like one locus for that is like how people live in terms of their family, how they bring up their kids, or like in this one, Merchander's Luck, you got this guy. It starts out as a love story, but it turns out he's actually dealing with all these sort of ghosts from his past on the ship where his family was killed by the Maziani, and the woman who he pursues at the start, by the end of it, they're not lovers. They're like partners on a commercial venture. But they're part of something. The other thing I was going to say too is, I'd say one theme that does really come up with this is a question that you're raising, and it's like you could say, who decides for humanity what humanity is going to look like in the future? Should it be we'll just do more of the same old bullshit from the past, just different faces, different names? That seems to be what Earth is doing, or should we in some radical way reshape humanity? And I think that's part of what the Union people are doing with their clones and tape, sort of mind, not mind washing, but sort of implanting all these things.
Do they do anything beyond that?
Well, I mean, they try to spread out to the other stars, and then they meet alien species. And I think that's another thing too for Cherryh, and this isn't really within the scope of these books, although there is that one alien species that's on the planet in this case. Through encountering the alien and not like shooting it or turning it into slaves or running away just in fear from it, we're offered a possibility for further human development in her works, I'd say. And different characters choose different things. Like some guys are the guys who, it's alien, let's shoot it, Now that goes, maybe what we actually do need, this is highly speculative for me to say this, but maybe what we do need is, in order to evolve as humans further, is something that's not human for us to relate to. And maybe it wouldn't necessarily have to be alien life, like going off to another planet. Like if we could really figure out what's going on with elephants or higher apes or dolphins, I don't know, maybe that would lead us to see things in a broader way that would allow us as human beings to...
What was that book with the things that had the arms and they would...
Oh, that was the Octavia Butler stuff.
Yeah. Right, and then they would be like,
I noticed too,
sort of transformed.
Noticed too in that one, they show up because we've like had a nuclear war and ruined the Earth.
Kind of decimated, and they show up too. Well, but, I mean, they were doing it for their own benefit too. But in the meantime, they were also giving some reward. Some.
It was benefiting them.
Yes.
Yeah. Another thing that they do with technology is they figure out, using that cloning stuff, how to replicate animals from DNA. So they get DNA from animals on Earth, then they ship it out to the stars, and then you've got a planet. Okay, we could make some fish there, and have, I don't know, bass or bluegill or whatever it is that we want to have, right, that we're used to. Probably they have other stuff, but they go ahead.
I wonder if that's like sometimes people's like excuses for not caring about extinction of the species. I know. Personally, I can say like, that is mine to a certain extent for not being as worried about species extinction is just we can clone it later, or somebody will clone it later. Not necessarily we, but like
if they're gone, you can't clone them.
No, that's right.
I mean, it's pretty. Maybe you can. I mean, if you still have tissue samples, but we don't have the technology to do that this time.
And if they're truly extinct, you don't have the tissue samples. It's gone.
I mean, we can clone. There's cloning's absolutely going on all the time.
Yeah.
We're cloning.
But if you haven't had the forethought to retain tissue samples.
Yeah. Well, I mean, extinct just means that all the living examples of that kind are gone. You can't.
If you wanted to go
them.
and get yourself a passenger pigeon, it ain't going to happen because there's nothing around that's going to.
Yeah, that's probably true.
Mm-hmm. Or a dodo or anything else that's been extinct.
But we've got things that are frozen.
Yeah, I mean, if you want to go dig up a mammoth and do that, but we're not going to clone. I mean, that just wouldn't make any sense. But, and plus, the guys that dug it up ate the dang thing.
Yeah.
So,
Another thing that I think that's really interesting in her works is the adaptation that human beings have to space. Like we see a lot of sci-fi shows where, like think about Star Trek, for example, or the Star Wars universe is even worse this way. All the ships have artificial gravity. Everybody knows where up is. And traveling in space for years and years doesn't really have any adverse effects. You just go to the gym and take the space shots or pills, and you're fine, right? But as it turns out, the human body is not really made to operate in zero-G conditions. Yeah, and so she spends a lot of time, not in these books so much, but in other ones, like in Heavy Time. What Heavy Time is the time that you're no longer weightless. From being a miner out there in space in your rig mining asteroids, and you go there and it's on a space station that has centrifugal force because of the rotation, and you have to decide what deck you're going to be on, if you want to file your claims, it's all on the heavy gravity deck. So they make you like go through this essentially gauntlet. And what you have to do as a human being in order to survive that is work out in the gym before you actually get there, your gym in your ship, so that your bones don't get too brittle and your muscles don't atrophy. And then while you're on the ship during your time, you need to like be exercising, or else your body's going to break down. And then there's other things that can go wrong with it as well. And she does a really great job in sort of like thinking through what would it take for this human body that we have to be able to survive out there in the merciless void of space. All the different fail-safes that could fail, It's really, again, if I had read this when I was in my 20s, I think I would have found it mind-bogglingly boring, But reading it as an older guy, I'm like, wow, there's so much thought in this. And the other thing I'll say that's a little bit related to this, she does a lot of setting things up with all these different characters and plots happening, and usually it's about like the 2/3 mark that I've observed, where everything starts to fall into place, and now everything happens very quickly, and then some sort of new resolution happens. But until then, it's kind of slow going, There was one other theme that I particularly wanted to remark on too, but do you guys have any other ones that you want to bring up or hit on, or?
I didn't read it, so I don't know.
Well, but that was a great observation about the human evolution thing.
Different one.
That's okay. If not, one of the things that I wanted to talk about is the role of female characters. She actually was asked about this, and she said, "My goal is to create characters that men can identify with just the same as women identify with the male heroes. Everybody wants to be a hero in what they're reading." And the greatest military hero she has in this is Mallory, the captain of the Norway, who makes the difficult decision to betray her admiral, who is betraying Earth, and then to help form the alliance. And she's hard as nails, And actually, there's a couple other female characters in there who are like that as well. And one essayist in a book called "The Dreams Our Stuff Is Made Of" said that the success of Cherryh's books is owed in part to other authors coming before her, who had this strategy of hypothesizing women who can cope in a man's world, rather than, as Leguin would have it, remodeling human nature on a maternal template. So Cherryh and other women writers of her time, from like the 70s onward, they deal with the gender issue in large part, not by saying, well, men and women, the proverbial Mars and Venus sort of thing. They say, no, you can have very Venus-like men, you can have very Mars-like women, and everything in between. It doesn't really, play out that these things are just tied in with particular genders. I'm not saying I'm not knocking Leguin's approach, which is to, sort of postulate alternate ways of being. Why not have three sexes? Why not have all these different possibilities? But I think this is something that actually works, and you see it. It took a while for that to catch on in the sci-fi universe. If you think again about TV shows, right? Think about Star Trek. It took quite a while before we had Voyager. First we had the original Star Trek with hyper-masculine Kirk that we all make fun of now, with his karate chops and stuff like that.
Well, and the pilot for Star Trek failed because it had a female second officer.
That's right, yeah.
And they would not let that happen.
The Pike episode failed because of the female officer?
Really? That was the original pilot, and the network said, no, cannot have a female second officer.
And then even with the new generation, okay, you got Picard, right? Very different than Kirk, but you know,
still masculine.
Exactly, and then you got Riker, who's basically Kirk, only whiny, you know, as well. And you do have more female characters in there, so it's not just Uhura.
They're not leaders as in the same way.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, well, you got Crusher, and you've got Troy, and who else? Anybody else come to mind?
Lieutenant Rowe.
Yeah, and they killed off the female security chief right at the start. You know, what's that?
Guinan, she's the bartender.
That's true. Yeah. And then then things start to change, and you get an actual female captain. You know, or you can have a female head of security, and it changes things so much. For me, it's like, it's kind of a relief to have these possibilities, because putting people into boxes like that is such a pain in the ass.
I mean, you don't get much worse.
That's true. Yeah.
But here's the thing: how much of it is a reflection of the society
slowly changing,
or the society as it is at the time? The scripts are written. When Cherryh was writing some of these books was at a time when if you wanted to succeed in business as a woman, you acted like a man.
Yeah.
So to be a head of a department or to be an
and I think that's still very much the case today.
Not as much today as it used to be, but
that's true.
At that time in the 70s and 80s, for women to achieve, they had to be tough. Hard as nails.
Yeah. Or you didn't like female bosses because they were awful.
You had to be tough and you had to act like a man.
Well, they weren't given the same. I mean, they were acting like the same as the male bosses, but they weren't given
but they were seen differently.
You think so?
No, I think it depended.
They had to do
like overreaction. You mean?
Yes, they had to do everything twice as hard.
Yeah, and like anything else, it depended on the person. But
so I mean, it's interesting to think about. With these are not that far in the future narratively, right? They're like, say, 200 years from now, 300 years from now. So if we've seen this much change in our lifetime, what is it going to be like in terms of gender, unless there's backtracking, in terms of gender relations, that'd be like 5 to 15 generations from now. Will that no longer be much of an issue?
We're not going to have a freaking planet at this rate because it'll be destroyed with climate change. I mean, I'm not kidding.
That is a major
What's that forward, backward, that backlash thing? Like right now you're seeing backlash against certain women's activities. There was
and not just here too.
And not just
Think
here.
about India,
parts
of Europe.
All over the place. The Mormon Church just issued a mandate to their women.
Oh, I didn't. What is that?
They are to fast from all social media.
Oh, that's an interesting thing to require.
Because social media is contaminating the women.
Well, there's a little male grievance in your age going on right now. Have you noticed?
Yeah, so it's a backlash, step back in terms of
that's
trying to regain control.
That is a really interesting one. You think of how prevalent social media is in so many people's lives, and for a lot of people, if they're kind of isolated, social media gives you a support network,
But the Mormon Church just made that issue yesterday, that declaration.
Interesting.
A denomination with no central theology or standard of theology, and yet they can still make policies.
Well, they have a theology.
Well, they do.
They have a theology. Very clear.
And they have a hierarchy, too.
And they have a hierarchy.
Yeah.
My understanding that it's kind of like each church has like some variation of like something else.
They have a main theology.
Yeah.
They have a main theology. It's very strong, very structured.
There are some smaller Latter-day Saints churches.
There are some spin-offs.
Yeah, that are much less centralized, and they're the second largest one is much more liberal, but the main one is very conservative, and they do have a sort of top-down hierarchy with overseers and things like that. But you can say the same about many other religious organizations as well, and it'll be interesting to see how they're able to adapt if they do.
I just found it interesting that declaration was made just the other day.
Yeah.
Well, the sadder thing is that people will follow what that system.
Well, do you think it's in response to like all the
Me Too, and it's a response
and
to
the
all.
Kavanaugh confirmation and stuff like that?
Absolutely, it's a response, because during the Kavanaugh confirmation hearings, I can't remember what the number was, I wanna say 700, that may be wrong. A whole bunch of Mormon women wrote a letter in terms of what
Supporting Kavanaugh or
not
against Kavanaugh?
Against Kavanaugh. But they wrote a letter in terms of women and paying attention to what women had to say.
Ah, okay.
And it was a whole bunch of Mormon women.
Yeah.
And
I mean, it's interesting. This is really far off track with respect to the Cherryh thing, but with the current Republican sort of makeup and so dominated by Trump, the one normally like very faithful Republican religious group that he didn't succeed with was the Latter-day Saints, in part because he dissed Romney, and in part because they had their own candidate, McMullen, who was running in Utah as a non-Trump guy.
CIA guy, that's right.
Yeah, and so I think they're kind of an interesting group in the current political situation, because most other conservative, let's call them constituencies, have lined up almost in lockstep behind the Trump administration.
Well,
Ones that you would have thought they would have said.
Well, it's not just
Exactly, yeah.
You have to look beyond our country, though. It's not just the Trump administration.
Yeah.
You're seeing the nationalist parties across the globe, and it's that we don't want progress, we don't want diversity, we don't want this fear and backlash. We don't want women to have the kind of power.
Well, like I said, you've been talking
And
about food chain for thousands and thousands of years. And things are starting to equalize a little bit. There's so much fear and rage out there.
There's so much fear and rage.
With males, and they don't even, they see it as a takeover rather than a partnership, and it's like, get over it. I'm not railing at you guys.
No, it's a human.
It's just like, get over it, guys.
It's a human nature thing to see it as a zero-sum game.
Yeah.
Right.
And I think it's human nature. I don't think it's just male.
I think
there's a thing with humans.
This goes to that evolution thing, though, and some of the people that I work on they looked at that precise thing, like if you think about Rainer Maria Rilke or Mary Wollstonecraft, they both looked at the issue of male-female relations as screwed up by being a zero-sum game, where if one group wins, the other group loses. And both of them made the case that, in a certain way, both sexes are being stunted by that.
Mm-hmm.
That now women usually have suffered much more because of that, and that was one of Wollstonecraft's points. But she also points out where men wind up, sort of imposing these ridiculous demands upon themselves. And nobody ends up being happy as a result.
Well, you see it with political parties and points of view, because if you hear people on the left saying, "Oh well, they're dying out anyway,"
the demographics sort of thing.
That's a zero-sum game attitude.
Yeah.
Well, biologically, men and women were meant to work in partnership. I mean, if you just take the brains, men are total agency. You put them under MRI and you say, where do you want to go for lunch? A, B, pizza.
Some men, not all of them.
Not all men.
They're somewhere pretty incisive.
I've seen these studies under MRI.
Yeah.
You get two women, where do you want to go for lunch? The whole prefrontal cortex
starts lighting up.
And there's nothing but possibility.
Yeah.
So what you need, so the brains were meant to work in tandem.
Yeah,
With the woman, there's too much possibility, so they need the agency of the male to wheel it down. But you need both.
Yeah.
You just need both. And this is why it was so when you're completely inhibiting a whole half of a population, you're leaving out all of the possibility and the progress and the things, imagination you can use.
Well, and the other thing is who then decides you need a third. You almost say you need a third party to coordinate the two other parties, but where are you going to get that third party? It's going to come from either one, or maybe if you can have some, maybe it takes having models of people who can.
It's getting there. It's getting there. The younger generations are figuring it out. They're getting there.
Some of them are and some of them aren't. I mean,
yeah.
it's interesting because there's also like a big rise in people who are just like opting out of dating and sexuality altogether, where they're like, screw it, this doesn't make sense.
I hear from my niece all the time, who's 29.
Yeah.
And she's so frustrated with her generation.
Really?
Because she sees them sliding backwards.
To traditional gender roles?
More traditional gender roles and women who you make the decisions.
Oh.
And she's watching that around her and getting really frustrated with women her age.
Well, gosh, I guess I haven't seen. I'm happy I haven't seen a lot.
Yes,
That's kind of
not standing
positive.
up, not taking, not having a role.
I got it. I again, my view is very, very, just tiny little section, but I don't see that with my students much. It seems like, on the whole, my female students typically are doing better than my male students. Less, not getting things done on time, or they more consistently contribute in class, and then therefore get better participation grades. And there's plenty of men who are doing fine, but there seem to be a lot that are just kind of like dropping through the cracks. Some women too, but it seems like there's and they do seem to exercise more control over their lives. I like to see it myself because I want to see everybody do well. But
I think, as someone who's a member of that generation you guys are talking about, it's, if you need to consider, I guess, the status of just waiting for someone to die or things like that, basically people in my generation are going to have to clean up all the crap of the last. I'm not saying 20 years. I'm not saying 50 years.
You're right. No, you're
I'm
right.
Not saying, I'm saying like the last 200 years.
No, you're right.
I mean, starting with even Napoleon, basically.
No,
And
you're right.
basically what everything's going with that. It's not just like sexual things. It's not just like economic things. It's not just overpopulation things. It's not just oil things. It's not just technology things. It's not just, are we going to get off this planet things. It's not just global warming things. It's not just rights things. It's not just racial things. It's not just, it's everything. It's not to say that you shouldn't, I don't know. I'm still trying to figure out my full opinion on this, but I think to say that saying I'm not going to deal with all of these things is the healthiest option for most people my age, because it's
too overwhelming, right?
There's so much. I wouldn't say it's too much for somebody to go through, but it's too much too fast.
Well, it's a process,
And changing worldviews takes an enormous amount of energy and an enormous amount of time.
Yeah,
it does.
And to basically, I don't know, it's going to take a little bit more time. I think I'm really interested in seeing what people 5 to 10 years younger than I am, so basically somewhere in between the ages of 14 and 19, because I think they will be able to digest everything that we kind of see. I mean, I would say millennials, I was born in 1994, I would say millennials kind of saw how the previous 10 years older kind of...
My Generation X,
kind of got to groove with some stuff, but kind of saw some things going forward, and individuals react in their own way, same as any other generation. But I'm really, basically the generation that's 5 or 10 years younger than me has had time to kind of digest and kind of grew up with the world is where it's at. And I think, I guess going back to the ties of how much not just tradition, but just how much baggage can old times bring, I think there's definitely a separation as far as just specifically technology use between someone who's 5 or 10 years younger than me and me, because technology is much more of, I guess, a present part in, I guess, the idea of someone 5 to 10 years younger,'s lifestyle than me. But at the same time, you could say the same thing for anybody at this table, compared with.
But you've never seen a world without political dysfunction. When you came into
this is true.
You have come into a world, a different world. She and I are the older end of this. But we have a good representation of generations here, but you really have not seen anything but dysfunction and other kind of things. And I say this oftentimes, to my daughter and to the two little grandkids, that, I said, I'm really sorry we really effed up the world this bad for you guys, that you don't even have, that it's almost a hopeless situation. That so many young people are choosing not to have children, that so many other things, because they don't see any, and it was the massive consumptive, the boomers, of the consumption of the boomers that got us here, that got us to this stage of greed and
It was part of it, yeah.
I think,
I feel bad.
I would counterject to say that it's a generational fault. That is totally asinine. I mean, I know people, I have friends who piss and moan about boomers like it's none of tomorrow. And I know plenty of
all
boomers.
The generations complain about it.
Exactly.
Every generation complains about another generation, yeah.
But but the old guard's kind of dying out. Like a lot of racism is dying out because, like my parents, I mean, yikes. All right, that generation is just about gone, and that's better. Our generation, when it's gone, it'll be better.
But when you look at the white supremacist groups, they have young people.
Yeah, but that's small.
I mean,
that's small.
They have people of all generations.
But you're always going to have that, Joanne. But the majority of people are getting better.
Yeah, I think there has been a lot of progress on that. There's pockets now, whereas
so much more.
Whereas you think about just like the casual use of the N-word, like in the area that we're currently speaking in, right, and residing in. If this was Brookfield, 20, 30 years ago, people would be throwing it around like that and only worrying if they actually saw a black person. Then they might tone it down. But now, I think there's a lot of people would be like, some of them would be, wanting to use it and complaining that they don't get to use it. And then there's plenty who would be like, why would I ever talk that way, And so there has been some progress at least. And
I was born in South Side Chicago. I can tell you there's been a
lot
of progress.
Yeah.
And I mean, you go down Maxwell Street on Saturday afternoon, and my dad would say, well, there's nothing but N's and Jews. I mean,
yeah.
and that's how I got the blues infused into my bloodstream that'll never leave, because I'm listening to the guys coming up from the migration, the greats.
My grandparents' generation in Chicago, everything was so essentially ghettofied ethnically.
Oh, absolutely.
That if somebody came into your neighborhood and you'd beat them up.
Yeah, you didn't.
And that's the way my mom and dad.
You didn't go to the Polish neighborhood. You didn't. We could go to the Italian. Could not go to the Polish. And certain things like no Irish. You absolutely knew. You had your little segment of Europe.
Yeah.
Segregation, yeah.
And that was the way it was.
I imagine it was probably like that in Milwaukee too.
Yeah, it was.
It still is to some extent.
Growing up, that's all
Not
I
like
ever
it was,
heard.
Yeah.
But in some areas, we still have some of that.
Not to the point where people are getting beat up though.
Yeah, down on the south side.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, down on the south side, the Puerto Rican neighborhood,
the
Colombian neighborhood, the Honduras neighborhood.
Okay.
Yeah, we do have some of that still.
When I was 14, I came
You
down
have
on
it
a bus to march
in
with
the
Father
Asian
Grappy.
communities. You still have some of it.
Yeah. I saw those Southside Polish men standing there with those signs, and we came up when we were marching with Grappy for housing rights. Holy maloney. I saw what anger and rage looked like in those men. I was 14 years old, and I was like, holy
something really interesting, to go back to Cherryh, that happens in Downbelow Station. I mentioned there's like refugees, right? And so this is coming out in the early 80s? Yeah. So, that's long before we had any sort of refugee crisis like the one that we're seeing in Europe currently, and to a lesser extent here.
Central America.
Yeah, I guess we did.
Central America.
We did have some of that going on, but not.
It's huge right now.
Yeah, well now it is, we did have some. We had the boat people. But it wasn't as there wasn't a worry that like refugees are going to swamp our culture, and that's part of what happens in Downbelow Station. These are all people from other stations who are brought by the fleet, and they're just dumped there, and they're told, hey pal, you got to take care of these people. So they created an area called Q, quarantine, where all these people are just stuck. Half of them don't have papers, nobody knows what's what, gangs start running it, and you can see a similar concern to what, again, not quite as big of an issue for us as it is in Europe right now. And they've been thinking about it for, a bit longer than we have. But she's already, approaching that kind of issue and thinking about how would people deal with it, and what are the dangers. When the mob in Q gets sort of riled up and used by the foreign agent from the Union, they wind up knocking a lot of stuff down and killing some people, and the fleet has to come in and shoot people and take charge, and it's a terrible situation all around. She's got some interesting discussions of mob mentality in there.
Well, it also springs out of a ghettoization.
Yeah, exactly.
When you create detention centers and camps and refugee camps, when you create those isolated communities, then within them you generate some other things.
And that's another thing that's quite interesting. So in Western societies, we do this. Australia does this. It happens in Europe as well. We've got this we should only punish people with prison if they've been convicted of a crime, right? And yet, when it comes to handling detention
refugees.
for refugees, and also when it comes in certain areas to doing jail, we hold people for sometimes years without giving them any sort of due process. And there's, at least if you're in prison, a lot of prisons are pretty bad, but at least if you're in prison, there's some sort of oversight, right? But a lot of these detention centers, not just for us, but like Australia, it's a major issue too. People go in and nobody follows up,
And it's natural for them to create their own society.
Yeah.
And have their own power structures.
And then we have things too, like in Chicago with the places where the cops would take people before booking, and they just disappear.
Those dark things.
Yeah, I forget. It is.
It's like a renditioning, but I'm trying to think where the things are called. Yeah. Just reading about that.
There's a philosopher who talks quite a bit about this. His name is Giorgio Agamben. He's an Italian guy, pretty old, and he makes a distinction. He's been writing about this for a couple decades. He makes a distinction between like a life that's recognized as belonging within a system, and then what he calls bare life, where you've got a human being, and he or she is just, that's it. They're alive, they're a body, and they don't have any sort of rights, or if they do, the rights are just granted by the people in authority, and they're not really recognized. And he said this is a real problem because this is going to happen more and more and more. And I think you see that happening and being discussed in these books, and we see that as an issue with detention centers or things like that today. Or people who are afraid to come forward because they're undocumented.
You see with voting rights.
Yeah.
We just had a decision in North Dakota.
Yeah.
It's a problem.
Yeah, I kind of wish, here I'm totally editorializing, I kind of wish we were less obsessed with voting as a right, and we were more like other modern countries where it's a duty, and everybody just votes, and if you don't vote, you get a fine. I mean,
Australia does.
Yeah, I mean, isn't it silly that we create all these bars to being able to participate, whereas in most places they're like, listen, if you don't want to participate, you're going to pay.
We have power structures that want to retain their power.
Yeah.
And they're afraid of losing their power. If certain segments
steal their way into it.
If certain segments of our population vote, they might lose their power.
Yeah.
And so.
Well, especially too younger people.
Yeah. They don't want younger people to vote. They don't want students to vote.
They don't register a few more.
Yeah.
Good.
That goes back to another issue, though. So, I mean, you're right. Your generation is going to be stuck, unfortunately, dealing with all these problems, and it's kind of do or die time. And the question is how your generation is actually going to get the agency. People taking their hands off and letting them do things.
I mean, I can only say what a southeastern Wisconsin millennial man would say. But I think, I don't know, I think to a certain extent there is a lot of fear, but even more so for a lot of people. And I think, and I'm saying this just based off of what I've seen, I think this is especially true for men, is a lot of men don't, I think this is especially true for men, but this is also true for many women I've also met my age, is that a lot of people don't really see a reason to care about what's going to be coming. That there's not really, I don't know if it's like existential or if it's just like a loss of hope or like
despair, in other words.
Maybe. I don't know. It's like, I mean, I feel personally certain elements of that within my own life. I mean, I think everybody does, but like, specifically looking forward with like what's going on in the world and like where do I belong. I think the reaction, I think for a lot of people is, well, pretty much what I'm saying is I don't know, and I think that can be a right response for a lot of people, but also like, I don't know.
That is an existential issue, and it's sort of like you're being called upon to do two things at the same time, which is figure out who you are and how to fix things. And maybe that's too much to ask of a lot of people.
And where do your desires like?
Yeah.
Well, you know what, I just, this is my hope, and this is what I kind of vision. At this point, a lot of the present institutional structures are breaking down.
Yeah, that's
they are completely and utterly breaking down, and I think we're seeing that.
Yeah.
And that's why all of this fear, rage, and stuff's going on, because we always see that. But what I see with this younger, and when that's gone, and it probably will at some point collapse, but what I see and what I hope for people coming up who have been so immersed in community, whether it's social media or anything else, that things will rise up as community from the bottom, and we will have actually demos in this country, and it won't be just this hierarchical come down. It'll be small community-wide things, and rule will be more like community rule, because you have more ideas out of 35 people than you get out of one. You know, and that's how I see the future possibly building back up, and that is a lot to throw on somebody. But like I said, that you might introduce at your generation, but it might be coming up from the kids right now who are just coming into their own.
I think personally, knowing, well, I mean, again, like I'm not the voice of my generation.
I know you're not. And I'm just putting a vision out there that I could see working.
Generally speaking, I would say with a large degree of confidence. I'm not very confident I'm not 100% confident that I believe this in a lot of my own opinions, but like this one I feel pretty strongly of, is that American millennials do not respect other people's points of view and are not open-minded to being that. And I say that for all political spectrums. That being said, I don't think that the future is going to be unauthoritarian. That's my point of view, just based off of like what I see, not necessarily what people act like, but like what people will say what they want. I'm not sure if that's just like
I have heard that they want authoritarian because they just don't want to be responsible for stuff. And so is that true or not? I mean,
some of it is so overwhelming.
Yeah.
There is so much that needs attention paid to that it's like somebody else made the decision.
Yeah, and you know, so this is a good place to close. You know, a lot of the stuff that's happening, this is sort of what we call technocratic, right? There's a whoever controls the not just the technology itself, but the processes. Whoever wrote the rule books and stuff like that, they get to decide because they can manage things. And maybe that's what a lot of